When we're organizing this event, I struggled to make sense of what does Romance languages have to do with the crisis in Puerto Rico. And the better excuse I could come up with was that we bring people together. So our thank you goes to Falvey Library, to the Hispanic Club, and to the Department of Romance Languages that have so agreed to sponsor this event. And of course to our panelists who have agreed to share their expertise to understand the current crisis in Puerto Rico. The panelists today include Dr. Christine Palus. She's the Dean of Graduate Students and Associate Professor in Public Administration. Dr. Michael Moreland is University Professor of Law and Religion and Director of the Eleanor McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy at the Charles Widger School of Law. Dr. Lowell Gustafson is a professor in the Department of Political Science, and Professor Derek Arnold in the Department of Communication. On some of your chairs, we have left some handouts with a fact check on social disparity in Puerto Rico. If you would look at the recent newspapers and the headlines in recent newspapers, they remind us of the devastating lack of water. They remind us how rapper Pitbull's effort to evacuate the elderly and sick, and an ongoing goal of restoring electricity by 95% by next December. NBC News reminds us that 3 weeks after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, there are still only 1,100 FEMA workers compared to 3,000 for Hurricane Irma and 4,000 for Hurricane Harvey. Fox News recalls a $73 billion debt crisis that has left agencies like the State Power Company broke. The Harvard Law Review states that the deficient Medicare system, on which half the island depends, has caused a massive exodus of doctors to the mainland. The Washington Post announced that Puerto Rico is facing a demographic disaster. The New York Times talks about a shortage of cash that is further crippling the economy. For the purpose of this panel today, we will organize ourselves in the following way. Each speaker will give a 7-minute presentation on the crisis in Puerto Rico from the point of view of their expertise. We will then have 20 minutes to ask questions and give comments. I will ask that you keep your interventions as short as possible, since we don't have much time. And then in the end, we'll hear an announcement from the Hispanic Club on upcoming events here at Villanova to help the Puerto Rico relief. Those of you in the back, there's a whole free road here in the front if you want to sit here. It's not as intimidating as it looks. So, our first speaker will be Dr. Christine Palus, Dean of Graduate Studies. I'll ask that you, as you all speak, you introduce yourself and your field of study. You have a microphone.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Christine Palus. Thank you, Adriano, for the nice introduction. I am a professor in the Department of Public Administration, and I do work on state and local government in particular, and in particular urban settings in the United States. So today I'm going to talk about, just to kind of give a general overview of how local, state, and the federal government works in times of disaster, and then some of the challenges that Puerto Rico experienced and continues to experience. I think an important point to remember through all this is that government agencies really do provide a very critical role in times of disaster, but oftentimes what that role is very unclear or confusing to disaster victims as well as to observers who are watching what's going on. And it's very difficult to decipher the many complex relationships between different government programs, different levels from the local to the national level. And of course, every storm and disaster is very different. The situation before, the way the storm or disaster unfolds, and of course then what happens in the aftermath. And then of course think about the different actors and their personalities, their leadership styles, and their experience. And so all of these things really play a role on how response and recovery happens. So first, what's just the role of different levels of government in a time of crisis? So, in a disaster, really the citizens, their local governments, and any voluntary agencies at the epicenter are the ones who are first to respond. They're the ones who have to cope with what happened. They're the first line of defense against emergencies and disasters. They're the ones responsible primarily for managing, a response or a recovery. So, people like mayors or the members of the city council, the board of commissioners, that sort of thing. And so, what a local government does once it learns about, a potential emergency is alert citizens. Think about evacuation. Think about how long this event might last, what the duration will be. What will the magnitude be? How much time do they have to prepare? Kind of work through all of those things in their planning. And sometimes they have more time, the more lead time, and other times they don't. In Puerto Rico, there are 78 local mayors who were leading that effort, a colorful group, a politically powerful group, who play a very important role in what's going on. We also saw the important role of the mayor of San Juan in all of this as a spokesperson for that local piece, and also a leader among many of the municipalities. So then when a local jurisdiction doesn't really have the resources to meet all the needs of a disaster, it then turns to the state government. And the state government is typically the agent for local jurisdictions if they need additional federal assistance. So again, today we saw the governor of Puerto Rico in Washington lobbying on behalf of his people. But again, before requesting federal aid, the state governments are relying on local governments to report damages. And obviously in Puerto Rico, that's been very difficult. Many of the mayors, obviously there was a major communication blackout. They had walkie-talkies that, sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. So, they had folks driving around to try and figure out what was going on. So figuring out the state of what was happening on the ground was very difficult, and then communicating that up the line has certainly been a challenge. And then, of course, when a disaster strikes and it's so severe that local governments and state governments can't respond, then they turn to the federal government. And, that is a really important role. And that opens up a whole array of supplementary disaster assistance to individuals, to families, to the community, that sort of thing. So important points to think about when we're talking about the role of government in disasters. First, that role of the federal government is really important because there are many different entities involved in a disaster, and there oftentimes the federal government is the one group that's capable of providing a timely, a predictable resourcing capacity. We know that when the storm hits, the local governments are often paralyzed, and so they need that stronger entity to come in and coordinate and that sort of thing. But at the same time, recovery is local, so there's this balance between needing the role of the federal government to come in, provide resources, provide coordinated effort and relief, but then also the notion that as time goes on, where the recovery is going to happen is at the local level as well. So, there needs to be flexibility for those localities to meet the needs of the people, the will of the people, and really, rebuild their communities in a way that reflects the community's, vision and for where they want to go. So the main challenges, to date, as I see them in Puerto Rico, certainly information, communication, logistics, and then also just the knowledge of citizens of the United States about the role of Puerto Rico, within the federal system. Unique to when you think about the role of the situation of Puerto Rico, they went into the storm with a very weak infrastructure, a government that's struggling financially. They were coming off another hurricane, so then when the storm hit, it made it even more difficult. Also, if you think about them compared to the states, in the mainland United States, they don't really have neighbors to call upon. When Texas could look to some of its neighbors to get resources, to get water more quickly, and all of those necessities. Puerto Rico, they're crippled. They don't have those same connections that they can draw upon. And then, of course, there's the unique political situation, of Puerto Rico. They're residents they're citizens of the United States, but they don't have, voting rights. So they don't have the same level of, attention, respect in the American government. So that certainly puts them at a disadvantage. So again, responding to any kind of disaster, crisis is very complicated. It involves many different actors at many different levels of government. Coordination and those challenges have been very, very difficult in the wake of this recent storm. So, thank you.
Again, I'm Michael Moreland from the law school, and I'm grateful to Adriano for the invitation to participate, and to all of you for being here. So I'll talk a little bit about some legal issues that are pertinent to Puerto Rico, and I want to talk about 2 U.S. Supreme Court cases and a federal statute that touch on Puerto Rico's peculiar status in our constitutional legal system. So Puerto Rico, of course, was conquered in 1898 as part of the Spanish-American War. And after that happened, the question came up very soon about what's the status of a conquered territory like that in the American constitutional system. And so, of course, previous territory that had either been purchased by the United States, say the Louisiana Purchase, or the like, there was a presumption that that territory then became, over time, eligible for statehood, with the exception of Texas, which was annexed by treaty in 1844. So within a short time, though, there came to be a series of cases that the Supreme Court heard. They're called the insular cases because they involve island territories, about, well, what's the status of something like Puerto Rico? In 1901, the court decided a case called Downs versus Bidwell. I won't bore you with all the facts, but it involved the levying of an import duty on oranges that were shipped from San Juan to New York. And so the shipper paid the duty and said, but hey, this is unconstitutional, right? You don't normally impose duties when stuff gets shipped within the United States. If I, export some corn from Pennsylvania over to New Jersey, I don't normally pay a duty on that. And he said, so this is unconstitutional. And the question that the court kind of struggled with is kind of captured in the motto, does the Constitution follow the flag? Do all the Constitution's provisions and protections apply wherever the United States exercises sovereign authority, or is there a differentiation of different kinds of authority that the Constitution applies to? And in this case, the court held that, and again, I can talk more about the details of it, but a lot of it gets kind of tedious and boring, but the basic holding was that Puerto Rico is an unincorporated U.S. territory, which means that some aspects, fundamental aspects of the Bill of Rights and constitutional protections in the Bill of Rights do apply to Puerto Rico as an unincorporated territory, the court held, but that other provisions did not. So that, for example, the levying of import duties on shipping of goods from Puerto Rico and other parts of the U.S. was constitutionally permissible. And so this really begins then this line of cases saying that there are these unincorporated territories, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and so forth, the Philippines for a time later, of course, getting independence, where the Constitution applies, shall we say, kind of unevenly or in these peculiar ways, which is why, to this point, Puerto Rico, for instance, doesn't have congressional representation, it doesn't have votes in the Electoral College. After 1952, it was granted by congressional statute, home rule, but again with congressional oversight. And that leads to, this case is more fun, I promise. In 2016, just last year, the court heard a case, Puerto Rico versus Sanchez Valley, and it touches on, again, this kind of weird status, or peculiar status of Puerto Rico. And the issue in Sanchez Valley involves a criminal defendant who was indicted for illegal sale of a gun, which is both a crime under Puerto Rican law, but also a federal crime. And the question was, after he had pled guilty to the federal U.S. charge of illegally selling a gun, could Puerto Rico also prosecute him? Now, normally, you remember the Fifth Amendment protects against double jeopardy. You can't be prosecuted twice for the same crime. But there's an exception to double jeopardy for what we call dual sovereignty. So if dual sovereigns, that is to say, if something's both a state crime and a federal crime, you can be prosecuted twice for it, under both the federal provisions that criminalize it and under the state provisions. And so the question here was, if Puerto Rico wants to try to convict the guy after he's already pled guilty to the federal crime, does that violate double jeopardy? And the court very interestingly grappled with this question of, well, where does Puerto Rico's sovereignty come from? Because the view that the court has and that we have in the Constitution is that the states entered the Union with their sovereignty partially intact, so that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has sovereignty with regard to certain matters, such that it can prosecute as a separate sovereign for the same crimes for which the federal government also has jurisdiction. And the court, in an interesting opinion by Justice Kagan, says, but Puerto Rico is different. Puerto Rico's sovereignty derives from the United States itself, because it's a creature of Congress. The home rule of Puerto Rico in 1952 is a creature of congressional legislation. And so Puerto Rico, for that purpose, doesn't exercise dual sovereign status. And so Puerto Rico doesn't get to prosecute him again. So it's an interesting case insofar as it turns on a very narrow question about, who can prosecute someone for the same crime. But it's an interesting question about, where does Puerto Rico's sovereignty come from? Does Puerto Rico retain a separate sovereign status from the United States? And the Supreme Court in this opinion said, that Puerto Rico, for these purposes, its sovereign, the source of its sovereignty comes from the United States, comes from Congress itself, and therefore it can't exercise dual sovereign jeopardy. And then finally, and most pertinently to this, again, another kind of quirky aspect of federal laws that applies to Puerto Rico is something that you may have heard about if you've been following the news on this, and that's something called the Jones Act, or more properly the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. So this was a federal statute that was enacted in the wake of World War I, when, because of German Navy and German Navy disruption of U.S. shipping and all that, Congress decided that any shipments of goods between two U.S. ports had to have a U.S. flag vessel, U.S.-built vessel that was primarily operated by a U.S. crew, so that this would encourage the building up of a large merchant marine industry in the United States. It would encourage the U.S. domestic shipbuilding industry, would protect the jobs of U.S. ship workers, and for national security and other labor and reasons, it would ensure the protection of the merchant marine industry. Well, this, of course, has become much in the news over the last few weeks because the Jones Act prohibited then any foreign vessels from importing. So foreign vessels can, of course, come from outside the United States and dock in Puerto Rico and transport goods. If you're bringing goods from the United States, you have to bring them on a U.S.-operated, U.S.-built, U.S.-flagged vessel. So this, of course, diminishes the capacity and the competition for different kinds of transportation of goods from U.S. ports. The Trump administration waived the provisions of the Jones Act for a time, but that waiver has now expired. And it's led to an interesting debate now about whether or not the Jones Act should overall be repealed. There's still people, unions and others, who defend the provisions of the Jones Act, saying it protects jobs, it protects the merchant marine industry, and for national security and other reasons, we should preserve it. But a lot of other people see the Jones Act as, sort of crony capitalism. It protects U.S. industry against competition from foreign flag vessels. And that we should open up that market in such a way as to allow foreign flag vessels, not just for the benefit of Puerto Rico and Hawaii and other places where goods are expensive, basically, because they're part of the operation of the Jones Act, but that we should repeal it altogether to open up that industry for more competition, which is a worthwhile issue to follow in the days and weeks ahead.
Thank you. My name is Lowell Gustafson. I'm in political science. Thank you very much to Adriano and the Hispanic Club. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate that. Well, we know there's a complete disaster going on in Puerto Rico. But who cares? It's not our problem. At least half of our citizens in the United States don't think Puerto Ricans are citizens. So, there's no particular obligation. And the rest of them kind of think that they're second-class citizens, don't they? Especially our president. He said, he went down there and he said, well, if you want to look at a real catastrophe like what happened in Katrina, unlike this sort of fake catastrophe that we had in Puerto Rico. Or I hate to tell you, Puerto Rico, but you've thrown our budget a little out of whack because you decided to have a hurricane. Everyone in Puerto Rico wants everything to be done for them, when it should be a community effort. I mean, what's wrong with these people in Puerto Rico? It's nothing more than what we need with a few paper towels thrown out to them, which the president did. So really, they're second-class citizens. Now, this is Trump's inimitable style, isn't it? I mean, he just has a way of phrasing it perfectly. And he responded that we're not going to keep FEMA and the military there forever. I mean, how long? It's been a month. Isn't this enough to recover from this? And Trump's done a fantastic job, believe me. In fact, he met with the governor today. He gave himself a 10 for his response to the hurricane. So things are going swimmingly in every regard. The Puerto Ricans are not quite so sure that he's doing such a fantastic job. In fact, they would like to tell him that, Yankee, you've thrown our budget a little out of whack. Now, who are the Puerto Ricans? Well, there used to be Taínos and Caribs a long time ago, but that was a long time ago. They're all gone now. Christopher Columbus showed up in 1493, and he began that relationship with Puerto Rico as a colony for the next 400 years, which is what they were. But then we decided to think around. Now, here's President McKinley at a cartoon about a century ago, asking Uncle Sam, well, what would you like to order on our bill of fare? A Cuban steak, a Puerto Rican pig, maybe some Philippines and something else. Or here's Manifest Destiny, almost the hand of God. handing Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam to Uncle Sam, who's now supposed to take care of them. We'll do the best we can with these unruly children that God has sort of given us. And then, as Michael said, of course, we did get them in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, when we decided sort of not to have them given to us, but we'll take them very much, if you please. And so we began our status as an empire. The first time we projected our power beyond our borders to start becoming an empire. And that means we have to start taking care of these people. And you know, here they are. Here's the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Black kids who are unruly. Unlike the white kids who are from California and from Connecticut and the United States, who are very studious and very well behaved. And here you've got an Indian reading a book upside down, and there's a Chinaman out there in the background. And if you really become well educated, you can hope to grow up and wash windows. And this is the cartoon from the time of what we're going to do to take care of our second-class citizens. Why did we care about Puerto Rico? We didn't conquer them so we could take care of them in hurricanes. We conquered them because we wanted to control the sea lanes through the Caribbean across what was going to become the Panama Canal so that we could get to the Philippines. So if the Philippines were there, and we were going to sell lots of stuff to China, and everybody was going to become rich. And we were telling the other Europeans, by the way, you guys, we know you've carved up China for a long time. Now we're doing that, so get used to it, and you can't carve us up. That's what the point was. Here are the shipping lanes. From Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore, they were all going through those sea lanes that Cuba and Puerto Rico were very important for. We did not want European navies controlling any of these ports that would restrict our access to trade with China. That's what Puerto Rico was about, not taking care of people in difficult times. And what we are taking on here, by the way, this is the white man's burden. Rudyard Kipling, a British diplomat in India, wrote this poem, The White Man's Burden, at the time of the Spanish-American War, asking us to take on that burden of helping the Anglo-Saxons in Britain rule the world. And here we are. They're carrying the Chinese and all the Asians, and we have to carry all of these miscreants in the Caribbean and elsewhere so that we can get over ignorance and vice and superstition and brutality and anarchy. Finally, we could civilize them if we educate them long enough, and we could work with the British to do that. So that's the goal, as Michael was saying with the 4-Acre Act. When we took them over, we passed this act in which the president would appoint their governor and their 11-member executive council. They're second-class citizens. We know how to take care of them. The insular cases Mike already went over, in which they don't have constitutional rights the way that you and I do, because they're in Puerto Rico, and they're not capable of self-government anyway. And the Jones Act said they can't go and try to get their own funding from international financial organizations. They can't control their own shipping. If somebody from Colombia wants to send some supplies to them first, it has to first come to Florida, get put on a U.S. ship, and then go to Puerto Rico. So there's all kinds of ways in which we are going to restrict their access. Just a few years ago, we passed the Puerto Rican Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act. Very nicely spelling promesa, or promise. And what was the promise? That the U.S. would appoint an economic council that would run Puerto Rico's economy. Because they don't know how to rule themselves. They don't know how to govern their economy. There's $72 billion in debt. And who's better to advise them than a government that's $20 trillion in debt? We know how to borrow money. They clearly don't know how to do it in the same way that we do. So for a century, maybe for 5 centuries, Puerto Ricans have been second-class colonial citizens. Is this a transition point? Are we actually going to start accepting them as first-class citizens? It's not going to be easy for us to do that for a variety of reasons. I'm afraid I'm out of time, but in any case, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you. My name is Arnold, and I'm from the Department of Communication, and a couple of things I like to study are legal crisis management and also conspiracy theories, of which you can start another line up pretty soon there. One thing I wanted just to start talking about a little fast is that crisis management and crisis crisis communication, one thing that we are always trying to tell our students is that words matter. And the things that you say and the way that you frame a particular issue are important, because that helps to make people think about the issue in a particular way. If you're good at it, you lead people to kind of think about something in a way that you find advantageous to you. So take the word crisis, for example. When we think of the word crisis, we think of a couple of things that tend to stand out. When you look at the word in the Chinese language, it's actually made up of two symbols. One symbol is of danger, and the other symbol can be actually interpreted in a couple ways. I'll talk about two real fast. One is the idea of there being a turning point or a pivotal point where the actual crisis talks about something which is sliding to a negative way. And I'll talk about the other one in a minute. In our language and the use of the word crisis, it's an important word because you just don't throw it out there for anything. Crisis means it's something that's really, really important. And maybe the biggest thing is the idea of time. When you're looking at time and how it is used, time condenses. Time really is kind of just, you can't waste any of it. So when in our country, when we look at politics, when we look at the idea of, a response to a hurricane, we try to pass laws as fast as we can to get money free. We take that money, we buy products and supplies, and we send them as fast as we can to the place. We send first responders and other folks to be able to kind of help put back the infrastructure that is placed, and that is all obviously incredibly important. But one of the things that it also means is that we tend to be, as the public, kind of passive. We tend to stand back and we say, okay, I don't really know how to do those things, so I'm going to stand back and let other people do that who supposedly know how to do that. So one thing it does for crisis is it kind of says there are people who can do some things, and then other folks get out of the way otherwise. And one of the things about crisis, which I think is important to note, is that it allows people to be able to be more active if you just know what it is that you're actually doing. And so it's been a month almost since Hurricane Maria hit. What have we got in Puerto Rico during that time, and what is the state of the place now? When you look at, I was looking at a CNN article yesterday, it said essentially in a month, FEMA has essentially satisfied or fulfilled 9% of the island's needs as far as drinkable water. If you take basic hygiene and cooking needs as well, it's less than that. And so what does that mean? That means obviously that there are certainly all kinds of supplies, and you've seen the stories that look at that. And so there's an issue. There's an issue that is important, because the thing that you'll see afterwards is that means that you'll have a potential of spiking of health cases that deal with things like cholera and other kinds of diseases, which are going to be even more important to kind of deal with. And we've had a month, and it's possible because we're not getting enough of these supplies to be able to address them. So we need people to stay paying attention to what's going on. But what does that actually mean? And what is the news doing at this point? Last night around 8:30, I went through a couple of news websites and looked at what kind of representation the story was getting. On the CNN news site, from the top all the way to the bottom where you can't scroll anymore, there was about 160 stories that were on the front page. 6 of them dealt with the crisis in Puerto Rico at this point. NBC's homepage, 185 articles from top to bottom, 5 articles on Puerto Rico and what was going on. On the Fox News page at 8:30 last night, there were 195 stories from top to bottom, scroll all the way down. Not a single one was about Puerto Rico. And I had to go back and look at it again. I thought, that's just not really possible. At 8:30 last night, it was. Now things have picked up a little bit because you've got Donald Trump making comments about how he gives himself a 10 out of 10 for the response. And one thing I want you to know is not just how he kind of quantifies things like that, but he talks about it in the past tense. The response has gotten, it should get a 10 out of 10. It is done. It's not done. And that's where you guys come in, because when you look at the crisis, you can create one. And the public, if it is able to kind of put those things together, can make something really important happen. The other interpretation of the Chinese symbols for crisis, some people interpret it as not just as pivotal or dangerous point, to go with the word danger, but the idea of crisis having an opportunity. And that you can have the idea of danger and opportunity. Yes, it's dangerous, but it gives you a chance perhaps to make a difference. So what can you guys do about this? one of the things I think is important to do, because it's so hard to talk to the people there because of the lack of cell phone coverage and the lack of electricity, is you guys can take over and you can do things about using social media. So if you look at the idea of how can you do something with that, it's simple. You know, go and find things that if you're tweeting, if you're using Facebook, and make posts or make particular kinds of things that kind of remind folks that this is not over, the job is not really done. And so what you can do is you can send out particular almost kind of tweets. And I was trying to come up with some kind of on the way over, and so you can see whether they work. I don't know. One could be just something as Puerto Rico appreciates the show of support for it during this trying time, but they can't even see it because they have barely any cell service or electricity. Then come up with a hashtag. You know, hashtag the job is not done. Send out another one. Yes, Puerto Rico is an island. I'm quoting our president. And it's an island surrounded by a lot of water. But that's not the kind of water that people of Puerto Rico desperately needs right now. Hashtag, the job is not done. And so if you're able to kind of keep that and repeat these kind of messages, that will make it something that people will be aware of. And that's the job. If you keep it out there and people can't avoid it because they're being told this, change the messages as far as what is the priority that you're pushing for. But always end with something that's consistent. The job is not done. Or something that you come up with that's perhaps even more creative and better than I. What does it do? It allows you to be able to help control what news does get to people. And in some ways, you can kind of create opportunities based on it. And I think that allows folks to be able to do something that puts them in, in some kind of control and gives them some kind of power to that. Thank you.
We have a microphone to pass around, so if you have any questions. Someone has a question? So then I mean, how is this crisis going to affect the status of Guam and the Virgin Islands? Do you see this causing a ripple effect, or is it just an isolated event?
I mean, it is noteworthy that we've almost not talked about the U.S. Virgin Islands at all. I mean, at least Puerto Rico's got a little bit of coverage. The U.S. Virgin Islands are completely forgotten. Now, in part, it's because of the population. There's only about 174,000 people living there. Some people suggest maybe it also has to do with race. The U.S. Virgin Islands is the one U.S. territory where blacks are the majority population. Now, we didn't conquer this territory, so it's not a very dramatic story like Puerto Rico is. We bought it, right? And so it's just one more of the little islands that we wanted control of so that the Europeans wouldn't somehow threaten our shipping lanes in the Caribbean and access to the Panama Canal. But the U.S. Virgin Islands have been as decimated as Puerto Rico has been by this, and they've received even less attention than Puerto Rico has. So how will it affect it? Well, they're aspiring to become third-class citizens.
I don't suspect things will change much as a matter of kind of the constitutional and legal structures around the U.S. territories. I think you could see some movement, as I suggested hurriedly at the end, are on some of these provisions like the Jones Act, which actually doesn't apply to the Virgin Islands, interestingly, but it does apply to Puerto Rico. It applies to Hawaii, of course, which is a state. I mean, I was kind of presenting both sides of the argument at the end there, but I really do think that the stronger view here is that this is classic, maybe economics majors or poli-sci majors, maybe you've encountered public choice theory and the idea of rent seeking, which isn't not asking your parents for rent to pay your apartment bill. But rent seeking is deriving excess profit through the political process. And I think people are now, especially with the Jones Act, has come front and center. Senator McCain and Senator Mike Lee of Utah have pending legislation to repeal the Jones Act because of this view that this is a nearly century-long legacy of economic protectionism for U.S. shipping and the merchant marine industry that makes goods and services in Puerto Rico and Hawaii much more expensive than the similar goods are in other markets, and in a setting like this has made that catastrophic.
Hi. I was wondering what do you guys think should happen with the discrepancies of the Jones Act?
What do you think should happen to the discrepancies of the Jones Act?
The Jones Act, in many ways, is a very typical colonial policy. The Europeans did the same thing. They all said, if we're going to have an empire, we want to be the ones that control the trading for this empire. So it was illegal for us as English colonies to trade with Spanish and French and other colonies. And it was the same thing for the Spanish. They didn't want their colonies to be trading with anybody else. That's mercantilism. It's the kind of thing that Adam Smith denounced. And he said we ought to have free trade. So in that sense, the Jones Act is just one more mercantilist colonial policy that says all trade that goes to Puerto Rico needs to come through the United States, needs to be on U.S. carriers, and that Puerto Rico is not a free actor to trade or exchange goods with anyone that they want to. It's a very old debate, of course, in political economy. What would a conservative who follows Adam Smith say, who liked it, which is a book published in 1776, our date of the American Revolution, he or she would say, well, we ought to get rid of it and let Puerto Rico trade freely. If we agree with free market principles, that's what we ought to do, and not have this colonial policy that we've got that's been on the books now, allegedly to protect Puerto Rico from the Germans in the First World War.
Would repealing the Jones Act have any repercussions for Puerto Rico?
Would repealing the Jones Act have any repercussions for Puerto Rico?
One of the things that Puerto Ricans have complained about is that one of the reasons it's been difficult to get aid to Puerto Rico is because there's a lot of countries which actually are interested in helping us. Now, we don't think we should have help because we're the world's most powerful, richest country, so we don't need any help. But apparently we're not getting aid to Puerto Rico. There are other countries that would like to get aid to Puerto Rico. And they've had a lot of difficulty in doing that because they can't just ship it to Puerto Rico. They have to ship it there and then go to Puerto Rico, which increases the expense and increases the time for it to get there. So presumably it would help Puerto Rico a lot to get rid of that. If I can impose on you, can I ask a question of myself? What should be the future of Puerto Rico? Right? I mean, should it continue as it is now, this unincorporated whatever it is that might be telling us with these uncertain status and no particular constitutional rights that we can seem to identify? Should it become independent? Why do we really want to have unincorporated territories? Should they finally become a state? Should they become the 51st state of the United States? So what's your solution to that? I'll ask you a question. Somebody explain what the future should be so that maybe they could become first-class citizens.
Our debt was already like 7 billion or something, and I have trouble with the conversion from Spanish to English. Now it's even higher, and we tried to pass a local bankruptcy law, and there was another case in the Supreme Court, I think, that said that was illegitimate. So if they're not going to let us deal with our debt, and now they don't want to give us a bailout, and the Financial Control Board hasn't really done anything. I was working in a think tank in the summer, and the members of the Financial Control Board haven't disclosed their personal ties to the debt, or if they have bonds or not. So they're already like corrupt in a sense, and nothing has been done. And like the president said that he was going to get rid of the debt, and then the White House said they weren't. So like, what's going to happen with that? I feel like that should be the debate. Forget about like the destiny of Puerto Rico as citizens or the hurricane relief. We got to deal with that. But if we don't settle the debt and get the economy running, like nothing's going to happen.
looking down the road, one it ties in somewhat to this question of continued Commonwealth status or statehood is that, given the economic troubles that the Puerto Rico is already undergoing, now compounded significantly by the hurricane, obviously. An interesting aspect of what I was talking about is that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, right? So they're accorded U.S. citizenship and have freedom of movement, obviously, from Puerto Rico to come to the mainland United States. And I think one concern that I've seen a lot in press reports is that there could be, there's already something of an out-migration brain drain problem involving Puerto Rico, and that this will only exacerbate things. Which again, it just points out, without, I don't have a grand solution for how one should tackle that issue, but it points out the peculiarity of having an unincorporated territory whose citizens are U.S. citizens, can come to the United States freely, and it's not, obviously it's not so much that they want to have a vote in the Electoral College that would motivate them to move to Florida, but rather the economic troubles that the island is experiencing.
So I would just throw in at the very end, just one of the things in my research I was seeing was that what was kind of amazing to me, because I didn't know, that a huge part of the economy there is pharmaceuticals. 75% of their exports are from pharmaceutical companies which are based in Puerto Rico. 40 of the top 100 drugs that are made in the world, Puerto Rico, their plants help to produce. 13 of those are actually what we call sole source medicines, which means that only one company has the patent to make that, and they are in Puerto Rico, 13 of those. So it's certainly something when you look at the devastation of the island in the future, even the short future, how are you going to get back on your feet when one of your major exports is going to be damaged? And those plants, how do you make that? So I would just throw that on the end to add to the difficulties, but also potentially an opportunity as to if America, the mainland, is aware, maybe there's more pressure to do something to make sure that that's kind of preserved, or even encouraged to continue to grow as a way to kind of help the island bounce back.
So as educated Americans that you guys are, thank you for your speech, but would you guys consider Puerto Rico a colony? I know your answer,
Unincorporated territory, that's a nice phrase. The longer the phrase, the better. It starts to obfuscate. Remember, brilliance is about obfuscation.
I mean, it's not that I want to pick a fight with Moreland necessarily, but normally when in the history of colonization, which would be very crude and abstract about it, one does normally accord full citizenship rights to colonies, and the United States does, and this is the point about the insular cases, right, is that there's a lot of, certainly a lot of, bad rhetoric in the insular cases, but actually parts of the insular, the holdings of that long series of cases about application of the Constitution, where the flag is, includes things like citizenship, right? And so if it's whether we use the term colony or not, according full U.S. citizenship to people from Puerto Rico is, I'd say, a departure from what is often the experience of imperial expansion, but also then exacerbates maybe certain other structural political problems.
I would say, as I was preparing for this too, I just kept wanting to read more and hear more people talk about just the moral issues surrounding Puerto Rico, as the way that we treat them, the way that we educate our children about Puerto Rico, and I mean, even the way we as scholars do research. I was searching every journal, high and low, and in public administration, trying to find more articles about Puerto Rico, and there are none. So I mean, it's a shame. It's horrible, and the way that what we know, what all the public opinion polls that have come out, in the last month, it's been so eye-opening to read about the level of knowledge of American citizens about what is going on in Puerto Rico and their role, and whether they're citizens or whether they're not, and just, I think if nothing else good, comes out of a hurricane, but at least there is a conversation now again, and people are trying to struggle with and understand, this place that they didn't pay much attention to before, and I hope that they will then grapple with the moral questions, or what does it mean to be an American citizen, but not be able to vote for your president. I mean, that just really is mind-blowing. So I hope we continue to have these conversations.
I think going right along that, one of the first kind of moral questions that was posed was, are Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens or are they not? And a lot of people's response was, should that even matter? Like, shouldn't we just be helping an island that is in trouble? And I think that the biggest thing that was the fact that a lot of U.S. citizens in the mainland don't know that Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. So that whole, any of you elaborate on that whole language component of it, of calling Puerto Rican citizens and acknowledging their importance within our nation?
I read one interesting poll where they were looking at, among people who knew that Puerto Ricans were citizens, they were much more favorable towards intervention, financial aid, aid and all that kind of thing. But among those who did not know that, they were much less favorable towards, assisting them and that sort of thing. So that knowledge breakdown, I think is really important in terms of where people are in reaching out. Now, of course, we should be wanting to help regardless, but that's sort of where the public opinion kind of breaks down.
Just one last thing to throw in. I would say that, to me, it doesn't help the bigger picture, but people should just automatically think of people there as Americans, and therefore, privy to the same responses that we would give anybody as far as that goes, regardless of state, because of even their efforts, but because they're Americans. Now again, I know this is not the bigger picture of how it is that you define the island itself, but I do think it's something that's at least where you start. And then you figure out where the lines are as far as what they can and can't do now. See if there are ways to, I'm not saying go, grant them state relief yet, or even I'm not sure the country is really sure about that itself. But it's important, I think, to note that you got to start somewhere, and even on an individual level, that might be the better way to maybe approach an event like this.
Especially we live in fraught times, of course, as you know, not just along Puerto Rico. But there are two things about Puerto Rico that, from the start, have always made it especially demographically distinctive, which is why some people don't know the American citizens. It's Spanish-speaking, and it's overwhelmingly Catholic. And those two features of Puerto Rico are different than everywhere else, certainly everywhere else than in 1898, right? At a statewide level. And so it's worth underscoring the way in which American history, and all of its complications, has tended to, obviously, to norm with another language, and anti-Catholicism has been right throughout American history, and in some ways we live with the legacy of 19th century anti-Catholicism when dealing with Puerto Rico as well.
At this point, I would like to thank our panel for talking to us today. I want to shame you on not sharing all the stories that you know. They're not available in the internet. Following Professor Arnold's suggestion, I think you should really get the word out, because what I've learned more from talking to students in the halls and asking them directly than I did on the internet, because the information on the internet is very partial, and they keep rehashing the same thing that the news agencies say. So it is your responsibility to share it, to make a difference, to do something about this, not make this just a extra credit event, but to get the discussion going. We're going to have a small presentation from one of our students. She's going to tell us objective things we can do in the next few days to help with the Puerto Rico.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Allison Yaddle. I'm a sophomore communications Spanish double major. I'm also Puerto Rican. I'm from New York, and my grandmother's hometown was destroyed in the hurricane. I was talking to her over fall break, and she said that out in the entire town, there was one working phone, and people were lined up for hours just trying to call loved ones and try to let them know that they're okay. it's devastating for my grandmother and obviously for our family who is now living in the Bronx. So I've been trying to do something on Villanova's campus, and the Hispanic Society has been absolutely instrumental in helping me out, helping me do this. We are going to be hosting a benefit concert for Puerto Rico on October 29th in the Villanova room at 7 p.m. We will be selling tickets from 12 to 2:30 tomorrow, next Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday in Conley Center. They're going to be $7. And a lot of the groups and music activities are helping out. We've got 6 of our a cappella groups and 4 dance groups, and we have there's just so much that we can do to help, and this is just one small way. I don't know if the clothing drive that some of the fraternities and sororities are hosting is over, but you can donate clothes. I think they were at the Oreo a couple of days ago, and there was a couple of bake sales going on where you can buy food, which is really, really good, and donate money. So like I said, the tickets are going to be $7, and we do accept donations if you're feeling generous. I actually have the cash box on me now, so if you have cash on you and want to purchase a ticket, please find me in the back. I'm more than happy to help you out, and thank you for coming.
Thank you again to our panelists, to Allison for everything, and